Question 1. Benchmark analysis indicates that during a post-fire property loss negotiation, an insured is visibly distraught, expressing frustration and confusion regarding the settlement offer. The property and casualty loss consultant needs to guide the negotiation towards a fair resolution. Which of the following communication strategies best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical professional conduct for a certified property and casualty loss consultant? Option A. Urge the insured to sign the settlement agreement quickly to expedite the process, emphasizing the limited time available for acceptance. Option B. Focus exclusively on the technical details of the policy and the loss assessment, disregarding the insured's emotional state as irrelevant to the negotiation. Option C. Acknowledge the insured's distress, patiently explain the policy provisions and the basis for the offer, and invite further questions to ensure understanding. Option D. Offer assurances of additional coverage beyond what is explicitly stated in the policy to appease the insured and secure their agreement. Correct answer is C. Acknowledge the insured's distress, patiently explain the policy provisions and the basis for the offer, and invite further questions to ensure understanding. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in property and casualty loss consulting, navigating a negotiation with an insured who is experiencing significant emotional distress due to their loss. The consultant must balance the need to gather accurate information and reach a fair settlement with the ethical and professional obligation to treat the insured with empathy and respect. Failure to do so can lead to a breakdown in communication, an unfair outcome for the insured, and potential regulatory scrutiny. The insured's emotional state can cloud their judgment and make them susceptible to undue influence, requiring the consultant to maintain a high degree of professionalism and ethical conduct. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves actively listening to the insured's concerns, acknowledging their emotional state without validating unsubstantiated claims, and clearly explaining the policy terms and the basis for the settlement offer. This method prioritizes clear, empathetic communication while remaining grounded in the policy contract and applicable regulations. It demonstrates respect for the insured's experience while upholding the consultant's professional responsibilities to accurately assess the loss and adhere to policy provisions. This aligns with the PCLC duty to act with integrity and fairness, ensuring the insured understands the process and the rationale behind the settlement, thereby fostering trust and facilitating a resolution. Incorrect approaches analysis. Pressuring the insured to accept a settlement offer immediately, despite their visible distress and confusion, is ethically unsound and potentially violates regulations requiring fair claims handling. This approach disregards the insured's vulnerability and could be construed as taking advantage of their emotional state, leading to an unfair settlement. Dismissing the insured's emotional concerns and focusing solely on policy minutiae without acknowledging their distress is unprofessional and can damage the consultant-client relationship. While policy adherence is crucial, a complete lack of empathy can be perceived as callous and may hinder effective communication, potentially leading to disputes and complaints. Making promises about coverage or settlement amounts that are not explicitly supported by the policy terms or internal guidelines is a serious ethical and regulatory breach. This can lead to misrepresentation, create false expectations, and result in significant financial and legal repercussions for both the insured and the consulting firm. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Assessing the insured's emotional state and adjusting communication style accordingly. 2. Actively listening to understand their perspective and concerns. 3. Clearly and patiently explaining policy provisions and the claims process. 4. Presenting settlement offers with a clear rationale based on policy terms and loss assessment. 5. Avoiding any form of pressure, misrepresentation, or dismissal of the insured's legitimate concerns. 6. Documenting all communications and decisions thoroughly. This systematic approach ensures fairness, transparency, and adherence to professional standards. Question 2. Governance review demonstrates that a recent property loss has resulted in significant debris, including fallen trees and structural components, obstructing access to the main dwelling and posing a potential hazard to the surrounding property. The insurer has instructed the PCLC to defer any debris removal until a comprehensive damage assessment of the entire structure is completed, citing a desire to accurately quantify all associated costs. The PCLC is aware that the prolonged presence of this debris could lead to further deterioration of the property and potentially create additional safety risks. Considering the PCLC exam's specified regulatory framework, which of the following approaches best represents the professional and compliant course of action for the PCLC? Option A. Strictly adhere to the insurer's directive and postpone all debris removal until the full scope of structural damage is finalized, regardless of immediate safety concerns or potential for further property deterioration. Option B. Advocate for the immediate removal of the debris that poses a safety hazard or is likely to cause further damage, ensuring proper documentation for the claim, while simultaneously proceeding with the comprehensive damage assessment. Option C. Inform the insured that debris removal is not a covered expense until the entire claim is settled and all other damages have been quantified. Option D. Proceed with the debris removal only if the policy explicitly states that debris removal is a separate pre-assessment line item. Otherwise, wait for the insurer's final approval after the damage assessment. The correct answer is B. Advocate for the immediate removal of the debris that poses a safety hazard or is likely to cause further damage, ensuring proper documentation for the claim, while simultaneously proceeding with the comprehensive damage assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the PCLC to balance the immediate need for property restoration with the contractual and regulatory obligations concerning debris removal. The insurer's directive to defer debris removal until after the scope of damage is fully assessed, while seemingly logical from a cost containment perspective, may conflict with policy provisions, local ordinances, or even public safety concerns, creating a potential liability for both the insurer and the insured. The PCLC must navigate these competing interests while adhering strictly to the PCLC exam's specified regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing immediate debris removal when it is necessary to prevent further damage or to ensure the safety of the property and its occupants. This aligns with the PCLC duty to act in the best interest of the insured while also complying with policy terms that often cover necessary debris removal as a direct consequence of the covered peril. Furthermore, many jurisdictions have building codes or emergency management guidelines that mandate the prompt removal of hazardous debris. The PCLC role is to identify these situations and advocate for the appropriate actions, which may include immediate removal and subsequent documentation for the claim, rather than delaying necessary mitigation efforts. This proactive stance prevents exacerbation of loss and upholds the principle of good faith in claims handling. Incorrect approach is analysis. Delaying all debris removal until a final scope of damage is determined, as directed by the insurer, is an incorrect approach. This fails to acknowledge that debris removal can be a necessary mitigation effort to prevent further damage, e.g., removing fallen trees that are causing structural stress or blocking essential services. It also ignores potential policy provisions that may cover such immediate actions and could lead to increased loss, which the insurer may then dispute. This approach prioritizes the insurer's convenience over the insured's immediate needs and the principle of minimizing loss. Assuming debris removal is always a separate post-assessment cost, regardless of its impact on further damage, is also incorrect. Many property insurance policies consider debris removal as a covered expense directly related to the insured peril, especially when it is essential for accessing the damaged property or preventing additional harm. This assumption can lead to underpayment or denial of legitimate claims. Focusing solely on the cost of debris removal without considering its necessity for safety or further damage prevention is an incomplete and potentially harmful approach. While cost management is important, it cannot supersede the fundamental obligations to protect the insured's property and ensure safety. This approach neglects the broader responsibilities of a PCLC. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a risk-based and policy-centric approach. First, assess the immediate impact of the debris. Does it pose a safety hazard? Is it causing or likely to cause further damage to the insured property? Second, consult the specific policy language regarding debris removal coverage and any endorsements. Third, consider any applicable local ordinances or building codes that may mandate removal. If immediate removal is necessary for safety or to prevent further damage, the PCLC should advocate for this action, ensuring proper documentation for the claim. If the debris is not immediately hazardous or causing further damage, then a more detailed assessment for scope and cost can be undertaken before removal. This systematic process ensures compliance with regulations, policy terms, and ethical duties. Question 3. System analysis indicates a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, is assessing a real property loss for a client who is experiencing significant emotional distress due to the damage and expresses a strong desire to sell the property quickly at a price they believe reflects its pre-loss value, even if this value is higher than a standard market appraisal would suggest. The client instructs the PCLC to base the loss valuation on this desired sale price to expedite the claim and subsequent sale. What is the most appropriate decision-making framework for the PCLC in this situation? Option A. Adjust the valuation downwards to a price that the PCLC believes will facilitate a quick sale, even if it is not a formal appraisal, to appease the client's immediate concerns. Option B. Prioritize the client's emotional state by agreeing to their valuation request without conducting a formal appraisal, explaining that this is a gesture of support during a difficult time. Option C. Conduct an independent, objective appraisal of the damaged real property using established valuation methodologies and market comparables, and clearly communicate the findings to the client and insurer, managing client expectations regarding the valuation process. Option D. Accept the client's desired sale price as the basis for the loss valuation, as instructed by the client, to facilitate a quick claim settlement and sale. The correct answer is C. Conduct an independent, objective appraisal of the damaged real property using established valuation methodologies and market comparables, and clearly communicate the findings to the client and insurer, managing client expectations regarding the valuation process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the PCLC to navigate a situation where a client's perceived value of a property, based on emotional attachment and a desire for a quick sale, conflicts with the objective valuation necessary for a property insurance claim. The PCLC must balance the client's emotional state and immediate financial needs with the insurer's requirement for an accurate, market-based assessment of loss. Failure to do so could lead to an underinsured or overinsured property, resulting in financial hardship for the client or disputes with the insurer, potentially jeopardizing the PCLC professional standing and license. The core challenge lies in managing client expectations while adhering strictly to the PCLC duty to provide an unbiased and factually supported loss assessment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough, independent appraisal of the damaged real property based on established valuation methodologies and market comparables, irrespective of the client's emotional attachment or desired sale price. This aligns with the PCLC ethical obligation to provide an objective assessment of the loss. Regulatory frameworks for PCLC typically mandate impartiality, accuracy, and adherence to professional appraisal standards. The PCLC must document all findings, including the methodology used, the data considered, and the resulting valuation, providing a clear and defensible report to both the client and the insurer. This approach ensures compliance with the PCLC duty to act in good faith and to provide a professional, unbiased evaluation of the loss. Incorrect approach is analysis. Adopting the client's inflated valuation, even with the client's explicit instruction, is an incorrect approach. This would violate the PCLC duty of impartiality and professional integrity, potentially leading to misrepresentation of the loss to the insurer. Such an action could be construed as aiding in insurance fraud and would likely result in disciplinary action, including license revocation. Focusing solely on the client's desire for a quick sale and adjusting the valuation downwards to facilitate this, without a proper appraisal, is also incorrect. Client satisfaction is important. The primary duty of the PCLC in a loss scenario is to accurately assess the damage and its financial impact. This approach prioritizes a secondary objective over the core professional responsibility, potentially leading to an inaccurate claim and subsequent disputes. Ignoring the client's emotional distress and proceeding with a purely technical, detached assessment without any attempt at empathetic communication is also a failure. While objectivity is paramount, professional conduct also requires effective communication and client management. A complete disregard for the client's emotional state can erode trust and hinder the claims process, even if the technical assessment is accurate. This approach, while not directly violating valuation rules, fails to meet the broader professional standard of client care and communication. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective data and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the core mandate. The PCLC primary duty is to accurately assess property damage and loss based on objective evidence and professional standards. 2. Identifying stakeholder interests. Recognize the client's emotional and financial needs, the insurer's need for accurate claims processing, and the PCLC's own professional and ethical obligations. 3. Applying professional standards. Utilize established appraisal methodologies and adhere to all relevant regulatory requirements for loss assessment and reporting. 4. Communicating transparently. Clearly explain the valuation process and findings to the client, managing expectations and addressing concerns professionally, even when the findings are not what the client desires. 5. Documenting thoroughly. Maintain detailed records of all assessments, data, and communications to support the final report. Question 4. Consider a scenario where a commercial general liability insurance policy contains a personal and advertising injury liability insuring agreement. The insured receives a demand letter from a competitor alleging that the insured threatened to initiate a lawsuit against the competitor without probable cause and with malicious intent in an attempt to stifle competition. The demand letter states that the insured's actions have caused reputational damage and financial harm to the competitor. The insured believes this constitutes malicious prosecution and seeks coverage under their CGL policy. The PCLC reviewing this scenario must determine if the policy's coverage for personal and advertising injury liability is triggered by the demand letter's allegations, given that no lawsuit has yet been formally filed by either party. Option A. Advise the insured that the entire personal and advertising injury liability coverage is likely excluded because the allegations involve business competition, which is typically excluded from such coverage. Option B. Advise the insured that coverage for malicious prosecution is not triggered by the demand letter because the policy's definition of malicious prosecution requires the actual filing and prosecution of a lawsuit, and pre-litigation threats, while potentially actionable, do not meet this specific policy definition. Option C. Advise the insured that the demand letter's allegations of reputational damage and financial harm automatically trigger coverage under the personal injury definition, regardless of the specific cause of action alleged. Option D. Advise the insured that coverage for malicious prosecution is triggered because the demand letter alleges the insured acted with malice and without probable cause, causing harm, and that the policy's personal and advertising injury liability coverage is broad enough to encompass such pre-litigation threats. The correct answer is D. Advise the insured that coverage for malicious prosecution is triggered because the demand letter alleges the insured acted with malice and without probable cause, causing harm, and that the policy's personal and advertising injury liability coverage is broad enough to encompass such pre-litigation threats. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a PCLC to navigate the nuances of personal and advertising injury liability coverage, specifically concerning the definition of prosecution and the potential for a claim to fall outside the policy's scope due to its timing relative to the alleged offense. The consultant must meticulously apply the policy language and relevant case law, which can be complex and subject to interpretation, to determine coverage. A misinterpretation could lead to an incorrect coverage recommendation, potentially exposing the insured to significant financial loss or leading to a bad faith claim against the insurer. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the personal and advertising injury liability insuring agreement, paying close attention to the enumerated offenses. Specifically, the consultant must analyze whether the insured's actions, as alleged in the demand letter, constitute malicious prosecution as defined by the policy. This requires understanding that malicious prosecution typically involves the initiation or continuation of a civil or criminal proceeding without probable cause and with malice. The demand letter's reference to threatened legal action and the insured's alleged actions prior to any formal filing are critical. The consultant must determine if the policy's coverage for malicious prosecution is triggered by pre-litigation threats or only by the actual filing and prosecution of a lawsuit. The policy's definition of prosecution and any applicable endorsements or exclusions are paramount. A careful reading of the policy's coverage trigger, or when coverage applies sections, if present, would also be essential. The regulatory framework for PCLC emphasizes acting with due diligence and competence, which includes a comprehensive understanding of policy provisions and their application to claims. An incorrect approach would be to assume coverage based solely on the insured's perception of being threatened or on a broad interpretation of injury, without scrutinizing the specific enumerated offenses. For instance, if the policy clearly defines malicious prosecution as requiring the filing of a lawsuit, then advising the insured that the demand letter itself triggers coverage for malicious prosecution would be a regulatory and ethical failure. This approach ignores the precise wording of the policy and the established legal elements of malicious prosecution. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the claim outright, without a detailed analysis of the policy's definitions and exclusions related to personal and advertising injury. This could lead to a failure to identify potential coverage for other enumerated offenses within the personal and advertising injury section, such as libel, slander, or invasion of privacy, if the demand letter's allegations could be construed to fall under those categories. Such a failure would violate the PCLC duty to thoroughly investigate and advise on all potential coverage aspects. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a meticulous review of the insurance policy, focusing on the relevant insuring agreements, definitions, exclusions, and conditions. The PCLC must then gather all pertinent facts from the insured and any third-party demands. This factual information must be carefully compared against the policy provisions and applicable legal precedents within the governing jurisdiction. The PCLC should then formulate a coverage recommendation based on this objective analysis, clearly articulating the rationale and referencing specific policy language and legal principles. If there is ambiguity, the PCLC should err on the side of thoroughness and advise the insured of the potential coverage implications, recommending further investigation or consultation with legal counsel if necessary. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, provided an initial assessment on a commercial property claim involving water damage. The insured stated they believed their policy covered all types of water damage. However, the PCLC preliminary report did not specifically address the policy's flood exclusion and seepage limitation clauses, which appear to be directly relevant to the cause and extent of the damage. The PCLC is now being asked to determine the most appropriate next step in their professional engagement. Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the policy's flood exclusion and seepage limitation clauses. Investigate the specific cause and source of the water damage to determine if these clauses are triggered, and then clearly communicate the findings and their impact on coverage to the insured. Option B. Immediately issue a coverage denial based on the potential applicability of the flood exclusion and seepage limitation, without further investigation or communication with the insured. Option C. Advise the insured to seek independent legal counsel to interpret the policy's exclusion and limitation clauses, and then withdraw from further involvement in the claim. Option D. Proceed with the claim valuation and settlement negotiations, assuming the insured's understanding of coverage is correct, and that the exclusions and limitations are unlikely to apply. The correct answer is B. Immediately issue a coverage denial based on the potential applicability of the flood exclusion and seepage limitation, without further investigation or communication with the insured. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the PCLC to navigate the complexities of policy exclusions and limitations in a situation where the insured's understanding of coverage may differ significantly from the policy's explicit terms. The challenge lies in balancing the insured's expectation of coverage with the insurer's contractual obligations as defined by the policy, while adhering strictly to regulatory requirements for claims handling and advice. The PCLC must demonstrate a thorough understanding of the policy language and relevant regulations to provide accurate and ethical guidance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the policy's exclusion and limitation clauses, cross-referencing them with the specific facts of the loss and applicable state insurance regulations. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the contractual agreement between the insured and the insurer, which is the foundation of insurance coverage. State regulation, such as those governing unfair claims settlement practices and disclosure requirements, mandate that PCLC act with honesty and fairness, which includes accurately interpreting and applying policy terms. By identifying and clearly communicating the relevant exclusions and limitations, the PCLC upholds their professional duty to both the insured and the insurer, ensuring transparency and preventing misrepresentation of coverage. This aligns with the PCLC responsibility to provide expert advice based on the policy contract and regulatory framework. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing the insured's perceived expectation of coverage over the explicit policy language. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it misrepresents the terms of the insurance contract and could lead to the insurer being obligated to pay a claim that is contractually excluded. This violates the PCLC duty of accuracy and could be construed as aiding in a fraudulent claim or misrepresenting policy benefits, which are prohibited by insurance regulations. Another incorrect approach is to ignore or downplay the impact of specific exclusion clauses simply because they are complex or may lead to a denial of coverage. This failure to thoroughly analyze and apply all relevant policy provisions, including exclusions and limitations, is a dereliction of professional duty. It can result in inaccurate advice to the insured and potentially expose the insurer to claims that are not covered, leading to regulatory scrutiny for failing to properly administer the policy. A third incorrect approach is to provide a definitive coverage opinion without a comprehensive review of all policy documents and endorsements. Policy exclusions and limitations are often detailed and can be modified by endorsements. Failing to consider these elements means the advice provided is incomplete and potentially misleading, violating the PCLC obligation to provide expert and accurate assessments. This can lead to disputes and regulatory complaints for providing incompetent advice. Professional reasoning. When faced with a claim involving potential exclusions or limitations, a PCLC should adopt a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the facts of the loss. Second, conduct an exhaustive review of the insurance policy, paying close attention to all declarations, ensuring agreements, conditions, exclusions, and endorsements. Third, research and apply relevant state insurance laws and regulations that govern claims handling, policy interpretation, and consumer protection. Fourth, clearly and accurately communicate the findings to the insured, explaining how the policy terms, including any applicable exclusions or limitations, apply to the specific loss. This process ensures that advice is legally sound, ethically responsible, and professionally competent, protecting both the insured and the insurer. Question 6. The control framework reveals a scenario where an aircraft liability insurance policy contains an exclusion for losses arising from operations conducted by a pilot who is not properly certified or rated for the specific aircraft and flight conditions. The insured aircraft sustained damage during a flight where the pilot, while experienced, was operating under a temporary medical waiver that had expired just prior to the flight. Fact unknown to the insured owner. The PCLC is tasked with evaluating the claim, which approach best aligns with regulatory compliance and best practices for loss consulting in this jurisdiction. Option A. Recommend denial of coverage based on the pilot's failure to maintain current medical certification, without a detailed analysis of the exclusion's applicability to expired waivers or the causal link to the loss. Option B. Recommend immediate acceptance of the claim, assuming the insurer will cover the loss due to the owner's lack of knowledge regarding the pilot's waiver status. Option C. Recommend denial of coverage based on the expired medical waiver, as it constitutes a violation of pilot certification requirements, directly triggering the policy exclusion. Option D. Recommend further investigation into whether the expired medical waiver was the proximate cause of the loss, while also reviewing the specific wording of the exclusion and any applicable aviation regulations regarding temporary waivers and grace periods. The correct answer is C. Recommend denial of coverage based on the expired medical waiver, as it constitutes a violation of pilot certification requirements, directly triggering the policy exclusion. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a PCLC to navigate the complexities of aviation liability insurance, specifically concerning the interpretation of policy exclusions and the application of relevant regulations. The PCLC must not only understand the policy language, but also how it interacts with aviation law and best practices for risk management. The core challenge lies in determining whether the pilot's actions, which led to the loss, fall within a policy exclusion, thereby potentially absolving the insurer of liability. This requires a nuanced understanding of proximate cause and the insurer's duty to defend. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the aircraft liability policy, paying close attention to any exclusions related to pilot certification, operational limitations, or intentional acts. Simultaneously, the PCLC must research and apply the relevant aviation regulations of the specified jurisdiction, e.g., FAA regulations in the U.S., or equivalent, to ascertain if the pilot's actions constituted a violation that would trigger an exclusion. The PCLC should then analyze the causal link between the pilot's actions and the loss, considering whether the violation was the proximate cause of the damage. This approach is correct because it adheres to the principle of good faith and fair dealing, ensuring that the policy terms are interpreted in a manner consistent with regulatory requirements and established legal precedent. It also aligns with the PCLC ethical obligation to provide an objective and thorough assessment of the claim. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny coverage based solely on the pilot's admitted violation of a regulation, without a comprehensive analysis of the policy's exclusions and the proximate cause of the loss. This fails to consider that not all regulatory violations automatically void coverage, especially if the exclusion is narrowly worded or if the violation was not the direct cause of the accident. Another incorrect approach would be to accept coverage without a detailed investigation into the pilot's actions and the policy terms, potentially leading to an unwarranted payout and setting a precedent for future claims. This neglects the insurer's right to enforce policy terms and exclusions. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the pilot's subjective interpretation of events or the insured's assumptions about coverage, without independent verification and regulatory compliance checks. This bypasses the PCLC responsibility for an objective assessment and adherence to legal and contractual obligations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, meticulously review the insurance policy, identifying all relevant coverage grants and exclusions. Second, research and understand the applicable regulatory framework governing the insured activity. Third, gather all factual evidence related to the loss, including witness statements, incident reports, and expert opinions. Fourth, analyze the evidence in light of the policy terms and regulations to determine coverage. Finally, communicate the findings and recommendations clearly and objectively to the insurer, justifying the conclusion with specific references to policy provisions and regulatory requirements. Question 7. The audit findings indicate that a property insurance loss consultant consistently applied coverage based on common industry understandings of similar perils, rather than a detailed examination of the specific policy forms, endorsements, and exclusions applicable to each claim. Which approach best reflects the professional and regulatory obligations of a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, in this scenario? Option A. Apply the insurer's internal claims manual and guidelines as the primary source for coverage decisions, as these are designed to ensure consistent claims handling. Option B. Prioritize a thorough review of the specific policy forms, endorsements, and exclusions to determine coverage, ensuring alignment with regulatory filings and the contractual intent of the policy. Option C. Interpret policy language in the most favorable way to the insurer when there is any ambiguity, to protect the insurer's financial interests. Option D. Rely on general industry knowledge and common practices for similar perils to expedite the claims handling process, assuming policy language generally reflects these understandings. The correct answer is B. Prioritize a thorough review of the specific policy forms, endorsements, and exclusions to determine coverage, ensuring alignment with regulatory filings and the contractual intent of the policy. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential discrepancy in how property insurance policy forms are applied, which is a common area of challenge for PCLC. The professional challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the specific language of various policy forms to a given loss scenario, ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements and policyholder expectations. This requires a deep understanding of policy construction, endorsements, and exclusions, as well as the ability to discern the intent of the policy language in the context of the loss. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the specific property insurance policy forms applicable to the loss, including any endorsements or riders. This approach prioritizes adherence to the precise wording and intent of the policy as filed with and approved by the relevant regulatory body. The justification for this approach is rooted in the fundamental principle of insurance contracts. The policy is the governing document. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing property and casualty insurance in the United States, assuming this is the jurisdiction for the PCLC exam, mandate that insurers adhere to their filed policy forms. Deviating from these forms without proper endorsement or amendment constitutes a violation of regulatory compliance and can lead to unfair claims handling practices. Ethical obligations require the PCLC to act in good faith and with due diligence, which includes accurately applying policy terms. An incorrect approach would be to rely on general industry practices or assumptions about coverage without consulting the specific policy forms. This fails to acknowledge the contractual nature of insurance and the regulatory oversight of policy language. Such an approach risks misinterpreting coverage, potentially leading to underpayment or denial of valid claims, which violates regulatory mandates against unfair claims settlement practices and erodes public trust. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the insurer's internal guidelines or claims manual over the explicit language of the policy forms. While internal guidelines can provide helpful direction, they cannot supersede the contractual obligations established by the filed policy. Regulatory bodies expect claims to be settled based on the policy contract, not internal operational procedures that may not align with the approved policy language. This can lead to inconsistent claims handling and potential regulatory scrutiny. A further incorrect approach would be to interpret policy language in a manner that is overly restrictive or ambiguous, thereby limiting coverage that is reasonably intended by the policy. This can be seen as a failure to act in good faith and can lead to allegations of bad faith claims handling, which carries significant legal and regulatory consequences. The PCLC role is to interpret the policy fairly and accurately, not to seek ways to reduce coverage beyond what the policy language dictates. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of all relevant policy documents, including the declarations page, policy jacket, and any applicable endorsements. This should be followed by a careful analysis of the loss facts in relation to the policy language. When ambiguity arises, the PCLC should consult relevant case law and regulatory guidance within the specific jurisdiction, always prioritizing the plain meaning of the policy language and the intent of the regulatory framework. If further clarification is needed, seeking guidance from legal counsel or the insurer's underwriting department, while still adhering to the policy's contractual terms, is a prudent step. Question 8. Risk assessment procedures indicate that an older, well-maintained home insured under an HO8 modified coverage form has sustained significant damage from a recent storm. The insured believes the property should be valued at its full replacement cost, as they have invested in upkeep over the years. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the professional responsibilities of a certified property and casualty loss consultant in this situation? Option A. Conduct a detailed physical inspection to assess the current condition of the property and its components, documenting all findings to determine the actual cash value of the damaged items, considering depreciation based on age and condition, in accordance with the HO8 policy terms. Option B. Accept the insured's valuation of the property at full replacement cost, assuming their investments in upkeep negate the need for depreciation calculations under the HO8. Option C. Advise the insured that the HO8 policy inherently limits coverage to actual cash value for the entire structure due to its age, regardless of maintenance. Option D. Immediately recommend a full replacement cost settlement for all damaged items, as the insured has demonstrated a commitment to property maintenance. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed physical inspection to assess the current condition of the property and its components, documenting all findings to determine the actual cash value of the damaged items, considering depreciation based on age and condition, in accordance with the HO8 policy terms. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the HO8 policy, by its nature, is designed for older, more dilapidated properties where replacement cost coverage is often impractical. The consultant must balance the policy's limitations with the insured's reasonable expectations and the insurer's contractual obligations. Accurately assessing the condition of the property is paramount, as it directly impacts the valuation and the applicability of the HO8 actual cash value (ACV) settlement for certain components. Even when the policy is intended to provide a form of replacement cost, the consultant's role is to provide an objective and well-supported assessment that aligns with the policy terms and relevant regulations governing claims handling and property valuation. The correct approach involves a thorough physical inspection of the property, focusing on the current condition of all components, particularly those that are older or show signs of wear and tear. This inspection must be documented with detailed notes, photographs, and potentially expert opinions, e.g., from a contractor specializing in older homes, to establish the actual cash value of damaged or destroyed items at the time of loss, considering depreciation. This aligns with the HO8 intent to provide coverage that reflects the property's condition, often settling on ACV for older structures or components, while still potentially offering replacement cost for newer additions or improvements if specified. This approach adheres to the principle of indemnification, ensuring the insured is placed in the same financial position as before the loss, within the policy's limits and terms. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the insured's subjective assessment of the property's value or the cost to repair without a physical inspection. This fails to account for the HO8 specific provisions regarding the property's condition and depreciation, potentially leading to an overvaluation or undervaluation of the loss. It also bypasses the consultant's professional duty to conduct an independent and objective assessment. Another incorrect approach would be to automatically apply full replacement cost to all damaged items without considering the HO8 limitations and the actual condition of the property. This ignores the core purpose of the HO8, which is to provide coverage for properties where replacement costs might not be economically feasible or appropriate due to age and condition. This could lead to a settlement that is not in line with the policy contract and potentially violates the principle of indemnification by overcompensating the insured. A further incorrect approach would be to prematurely deny coverage based on the property's age alone, without a detailed assessment of the loss and the specific policy provisions. The HO8 is intended to provide coverage for such properties, and a denial without proper investigation and application of policy terms would be a regulatory failure and a breach of professional duty. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understanding the specific policy form, HO8 in this case, and its endorsements. Second, conducting a comprehensive physical inspection and documenting findings meticulously. Third, applying relevant valuation methods, ACV, replacement cost, considering depreciation as per policy terms. Fourth, communicating findings clearly and objectively to both the insured and the insurer. And fifth, ensuring all actions comply with applicable insurance regulations and ethical standards. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a PCLC is handling a property loss claim where the insured is experiencing significant damage to their primary residence. The insured is distressed and insists that their valuable antique furniture, which was damaged in the loss, should be covered under Coverage A dwelling, because it was an integral part of their home's aesthetic and value. The insured also believes that a detached but structurally sound shed used for storage should be considered part of the dwelling and therefore covered under Coverage A, not Coverage B, other structures. Furthermore, the insured is requesting that the cost of replacing their entire wardrobe, which was also damaged, be considered under coverage as well, arguing it's a necessary component of making the home livable again. The PCLC must determine the appropriate application of coverages A, B, and C. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethical obligations for a PCLC? Option A. Agree with the insured's interpretation to ensure client satisfaction, reclassifying the antique furniture and wardrobe as part of the dwelling under Coverage A, and treating the shed as an extension of the dwelling also under Coverage A, thereby maximizing the payout for the insured. Option B. Advise the insured that Coverage A is specifically for the dwelling structure and its attached components, Coverage B is for other detached structures, and Coverage C is for personal property. Therefore, the antique furniture and wardrobe would fall under Coverage C, and the shed under Coverage B, with coverage limits and deductibles applied accordingly. Option C. Inform the insured that while coverage A is for the dwelling, the antique furniture and wardrobe can be considered dwelling contents, and thus eligible for coverage A, and that the shed can be included under coverage as it contributes to the overall functionality of the property. Option D. Suggest to the insured that since the loss is substantial, it would be best to interpret coverage broadly to encompass all damaged items, including the furniture, wardrobe, and shed, to ensure the insured receives a comprehensive settlement that reflects the total loss of their home's contents and structures. The correct answer is B. Advise the insured that coverage is specifically for the dwelling structure and its attached components, coverage B is for other detached structures, and coverage C is for personal property. Therefore, the antique furniture and wardrobe would fall under coverage C, and the shed under coverage B, with coverage limits and deductibles applied accordingly. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the PCLC to navigate a conflict between a client's immediate desire for a favorable outcome and the PCLC duty to accurately assess and report coverage based on the policy terms and applicable regulations. The PCLC must exercise independent professional judgment, prioritizing adherence to policy language and regulatory requirements over client pressure. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the policy's coverage A, dwelling, coverage B, other structures, and coverage C, personal property provisions, along with any endorsements or exclusions, and then applying these to the specific facts of the loss. This approach is correct because it upholds the PCLC fiduciary duty to the insurer, as the PCLC is typically engaged by the insurer, and the insured to act with integrity and competence. It aligns with the fundamental principles of insurance claims handling, which mandate that benefits are paid strictly in accordance with the contract of insurance and relevant statutes. The PCLC role is to interpret the policy and determine coverage, not to create coverage or to unduly influence the claim outcome to satisfy the insured's expectations if those expectations are not supported by the policy. Adherence to the policy terms and regulatory framework ensures fair and equitable claims settlement, preventing potential bad faith claims against the insurer and maintaining the PCLC professional reputation. An incorrect approach would be to interpret coverage C, personal property, broadly to include items that are clearly excluded or not intended to be covered under that section, simply to appease the insured and expedite the claim. This fails to adhere to the policy's specific definitions and limitations for personal property, potentially leading to an overpayment of the claim and a violation of the PCLC duty to accurately assess coverage. Such an action could be construed as a breach of professional ethics and potentially violate regulations governing claims handling by misrepresenting coverage. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the insured that coverage B, other structures, can be used to compensate for losses to the dwelling itself, even if the dwelling is damaged. This misapplies the policy structure, as coverage A is specifically designated for the dwelling. Using coverage B for dwelling damage would be a misinterpretation of the policy's intent and structure, leading to an inaccurate coverage determination and potentially an improper claim payment. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of fundamental policy structures and a failure to apply the policy as written. A third incorrect approach would be to suggest that the PCLC can find coverage under any of the sections, A, B, or C, to meet the insured's perceived loss amount, irrespective of the policy language. This is ethically unsound and professionally irresponsible. The PCLC role is to interpret existing coverage, not to invent or manipulate coverage to fit a desired outcome. This approach disregards the contractual nature of insurance and the regulatory obligation to handle claims based on established policy terms and conditions. It undermines the integrity of the claims process and exposes the PCLC to disciplinary action and legal liability. The professional decision-making process for similar situations requires the PCLC to 1. Thoroughly understand the policy contract, including all definitions, endorsements, and exclusions. 2. Gather all relevant facts about the loss. 3. Apply the policy terms to the facts objectively. 4. Communicate findings clearly and accurately to all parties involved, explaining the basis for coverage determinations. And 5. Adhere strictly to all applicable laws and regulations governing claims handling and professional conduct. When faced with client pressure, the PCLC must remain firm in their professional assessment, explaining the rationale based on the policy and regulations, and documenting all communications and decisions. Question 10. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while investigating the precise nature of a business relationship can be time-consuming, it is crucial for upholding the principles of indemnity. A claimant asserts an insurable interest in a piece of specialized manufacturing equipment that they are leasing to a third party for a period of 5 years, with an option to purchase at the end of the lease term. The equipment was significantly damaged during a fire at the third party's facility. The claimant is the legal owner of the equipment. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates adherence to the regulatory framework governing insurable interest for a PCLC? Option A. Deny the claim because the claimant is not currently operating the equipment and the third party bears the operational risk. Option B. Investigate the lease agreement and the claimant's financial exposure to the damage, considering their ownership and the potential loss of future rental income and residual value, to determine if a valid insurable interest exists at the time of the loss. Option C. Recommend denying the claim based on the claimant's potential future profit from the purchase option, as this represents a speculative interest rather than a present financial loss. Option D. Approve the claim because the claimant is the legal owner of the equipment and therefore has an insurable interest. The correct answer is D. Approve the claim because the claimant is the legal owner of the equipment and therefore has an insurable interest. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a PCLC to navigate the nuanced application of insurable interest in a situation where the financial relationship is indirect and evolving. The PCLC must determine if a legitimate financial stake exists at the time of loss, which is a fundamental requirement for a valid insurance contract. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a mere hope of future gain and a present, tangible interest that would be jeopardized by the loss. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the contractual agreements and the practical realities of the business relationship to establish a direct financial stake. This means verifying that the claimant has a legal or equitable relationship to the property, such that they would suffer a direct financial loss if the property were damaged or destroyed. This aligns with the core principle of insurable interest, which is designed to prevent speculative insurance and ensure that insurance contracts are for indemnity rather than wagering. Regulatory frameworks for PCLC emphasize the importance of upholding the integrity of insurance contracts by ensuring valid insurable interest exists at the inception of the policy and at the time of loss. An incorrect approach would be to assume insurable interest based solely on the claimant's stated intention to benefit from the property's use or potential future sale. This fails to recognize that insurable interest must be a present, quantifiable financial stake, not a speculative expectation. Another incorrect approach would be to approve the claim based on the claimant's emotional attachment or perceived moral right to compensation, as insurance is a contract of indemnity for financial loss, not a charitable payout. Such an approach would violate the principle of indemnity and could lead to fraudulent claims being paid, undermining the insurance system. A further incorrect approach would be to deny the claim solely because the claimant is not the legal owner of the property, without investigating potential equitable interests or contractual rights that might confer insurable interest. This overlooks the fact that insurable interest can arise from various legal and contractual relationships beyond outright ownership. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive review of all relevant documentation, including contracts, leases, and business agreements. They must then apply the legal and regulatory definitions of insurable interest to the facts, seeking to understand the claimant's actual financial exposure to the loss. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel or senior claims adjusters experienced in complex insurable interest matters is a prudent step. Question 11. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a commercial building, constructed in 1975, has sustained significant fire damage to a portion of its roof and interior. The local building code, updated in 2010, mandates stricter seismic bracing requirements for all roof structures and requires that any reconstruction involving more than 25% of the roof area must bring the entire roof into compliance with current seismic standards. The PCLC is tasked with evaluating the potential impact of ordinance or law coverage. Which of the following best represents a proactive and compliant approach to assessing this risk? Option A. Focus the assessment on the cost of repairing the fire-damaged roof section only, and suggest the insured inquire with the local building department about potential future code upgrade requirements after the repairs are completed. Option B. Recommend a detailed review of the applicable building codes and ordinances, an estimation of the costs to upgrade the entire roof structure to meet current seismic bracing requirements, and a discussion with the insured about the necessity and scope of ordinance or law coverage. Option C. Advise the insured that ordinance or law coverage is typically limited and may not apply to pre-existing code deficiencies, focusing the assessment solely on the direct fire damage repair costs. Option D. Assume that the insurer will automatically cover any costs associated with bringing the building into compliance with current codes, as this is a standard expectation for commercial property insurance. Correct answer is C. Advise the insured that ordinance or law coverage is typically limited and may not apply to pre-existing code deficiencies, focusing the assessment solely on the direct fire damage repair costs. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the PCLC must navigate the complexities of ordinance or law coverage, which is often misunderstood and can lead to significant coverage gaps if not properly assessed. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the potential impact of building code upgrades triggered by damage, and then ensuring the insured has appropriate coverage for these increased costs. The PCLC must go beyond simply assessing the physical damage to the structure and consider the legal and regulatory requirements for rebuilding. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the insured's property, including its age, construction, and any known code compliance issues. This includes understanding the specific building codes applicable to the jurisdiction where the property is located and how those codes might be triggered by a covered loss. The PCLC should then evaluate the potential cost of bringing the undamaged portions of the building, or the entire structure if rebuilt, into compliance with current ordinances. This proactive assessment ensures that the insured is adequately protected against the often substantial costs associated with ordinance or law endorsements, aligning with the PCLC ethical duty to represent the insured's best interests and the regulatory expectation to provide competent advice. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the direct physical damage to the property and assume that ordinance or law coverage is automatically included or will be addressed by the insurer without specific investigation. This fails to acknowledge the distinct nature of ordinance or law coverage, which is typically an endorsement and requires specific consideration during the risk assessment phase. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the potential impact of building codes, assuming they are unlikely to be triggered or that the costs will be negligible. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to understand the potential financial exposure to the insured. Relying solely on the insurer's standard policy language without a detailed analysis of the insured's specific risk profile and local ordinances is also an inadequate approach, as it may overlook unique circumstances or local requirements not adequately addressed by generic policy provisions. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory environment of the insured property. This involves identifying the relevant building codes and ordinances. Second, they must assess the potential for these codes to be triggered by a loss, considering factors like the extent of damage and the age of the structure. Third, they should quantify the potential costs of compliance, which may involve consulting with building professionals. Finally, they must clearly communicate these risks and coverage options to the insured, ensuring informed decision-making regarding ordinance or law endorsements. Question 12. Compliance review shows a property insurance claim has been filed by an individual who recently sold the insured building. The sale was finalized, and legal title transferred to the buyer 1 week prior to a fire that significantly damaged the property. The seller, who filed the claim, argues they should be compensated because they had a long-standing relationship with the property and were in the process of negotiating a new, separate insurance policy for a different property they intended to purchase with the sale proceeds. Which of the following best reflects the PCLC assessment of the seller's claim based on basic property insurance concepts? Option A. The seller's claim is valid because they had an insurable interest in the property at the time of the loss due to their prior ownership and financial involvement. Option B. The seller's claim is valid because they had a strong emotional attachment to the property and a history of maintaining it. Option C. The seller's claim is valid because they intended to use the sale proceeds to acquire another property, demonstrating a continued financial interest in property generally. Option D. The seller's claim is invalid because insurable interest must exist at the time of the loss, and legal title had transferred to the buyer before the fire. The correct answer is A. The seller's claim is valid because they had an insurable interest in the property at the time of the loss due to their prior ownership and financial involvement. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the PCLC to navigate the nuances of property insurance principles, specifically the concept of insurable interest. In a situation where the ownership of the insured property is in flux, the PCLC must apply the fundamental principle of insurable interest to determine if a valid claim can be made, ensuring compliance with regulatory requirements and ethical obligations to both the insurer and the insured. The correct approach involves recognizing that insurable interest must exist at the time of the loss. This means the claimant must have a financial stake in the property, such that they would suffer a direct financial loss if the property were damaged or destroyed. This principle is foundational to property insurance contracts and is universally recognized in insurance law and regulation to prevent wagering and moral hazard. An incorrect approach would be to assume that insurable interest exists solely based on the fact that the claimant was the previous owner or had a prior relationship with the property. This fails to acknowledge the legal and financial transfer of ownership that occurred before the loss. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the intent of the parties to transfer ownership, without considering whether the transfer was legally completed and effective at the time of the loss. This overlooks the critical requirement of legal standing. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to base the decision on the claimant's emotional attachment to the property. While understandable, emotional attachment does not constitute a financial or economic interest required for insurable interest under insurance law. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the key legal and contractual elements at play. This involves meticulously reviewing ownership documents, sale agreements, and the insurance policy itself. The core question to answer is whether the claimant had a legally recognized financial stake in the property at the precise moment the loss occurred. This analytical process, grounded in the principle of insurable interest and supported by relevant legal precedents and regulatory guidance, ensures a fair and compliant outcome. Question 13. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some loss consultants are perceived as either overly accommodating to insured's immediate demands or excessively focused on insurer cost containment, potentially compromising the integrity of the loss adjusting process. As a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, how should you approach a complex commercial property loss where initial damage assessments by the insured's representatives differ significantly from preliminary findings by the insurer's risk engineer? Option A. Delay the investigation and communication with both parties until a clear consensus emerges between the insured's representatives and the insurer's risk engineer to avoid conflict. Option B. Prioritize the insurer's risk engineer's assessment as the most authoritative, focusing your efforts on justifying their findings to the insured and minimizing the claim value. Option C. Conduct a thorough, independent investigation, meticulously documenting all findings, and facilitate a transparent discussion between the insured and insurer regarding the discrepancies, referencing policy terms and relevant loss assessment guidelines. Option D. Immediately accept the insured's damage assessment to expedite the claim and maintain positive insured relations, informing the insurer of the likely settlement figure. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough, independent investigation, meticulously documenting all findings, and facilitate a transparent discussion between the insured and insurer regarding the discrepancies, referencing policy terms and relevant loss assessment guidelines. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the loss consultant must balance the insured's desire for a swift resolution with the insurer's need for thorough investigation and adherence to policy terms. The consultant's duty is to act with integrity and competence, ensuring a fair and accurate assessment of the loss. The core of the challenge lies in navigating potential conflicts of interest and maintaining objectivity while managing stakeholder expectations. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented investigation that adheres strictly to the policy wording and relevant regulatory guidelines. This means gathering all necessary evidence, objectively assessing the damage, and communicating findings clearly and transparently to both the insured and the insurer. This approach is justified by the PCLC ethical obligations to conduct a fair and impartial investigation, to act with due diligence, and to uphold the principles of good faith and fair dealing as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing insurance claims handling. It ensures that the settlement is based on facts and policy provisions, protecting both parties from undue prejudice. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the insured's immediate satisfaction over a complete investigation would fail to meet the consultant's professional responsibilities. This could lead to an inaccurate assessment, potentially resulting in an underpayment or overpayment of the claim, both of which violate the principles of fair claims handling and could expose the consultant to regulatory sanctions for negligence or misconduct. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on minimizing the insurer's payout without a thorough and objective assessment of the loss would also be professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of impartiality and could be construed as acting outside the scope of a fair and accurate loss assessment, potentially breaching contractual obligations and regulatory requirements for good faith claims handling. Finally, an approach that delays the investigation unnecessarily or fails to communicate effectively with stakeholders would undermine trust and could lead to disputes, violating the duty of prompt and efficient claims handling expected of a PCLC. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the policy terms and conditions, followed by a comprehensive and objective investigation. This involves systematically collecting and analyzing evidence, consulting with experts when necessary, and documenting all findings and decisions. Throughout the process, open and honest communication with all parties is paramount, ensuring that expectations are managed and that the process is transparent. Adherence to ethical codes and regulatory requirements should guide every step, ensuring that the final outcome is fair, accurate, and defensible. Question 14. The risk matrix shows a potential coverage limitation related to water damage due to a slow leak, as stipulated in the insured's property insurance policy. The insured is adamant that the damage is extensive and should be fully covered. As a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Assure the insured that you will advocate for full coverage and will attempt to find a way to circumvent the limitation clause to ensure their claim is paid. Option B. Proceed with the claim investigation without mentioning the limitation clause to the insured until a final coverage decision is made by the insurer. Option C. Immediately advise the insured that the policy clearly excludes slow leak water damage and the claim will be denied. Option D. Inform the insured that while the policy contains a limitation for slow leak water damage, a thorough review of the policy wording and the specific circumstances of the loss is required to determine its applicability, and that you will provide an objective assessment based on this review. The correct answer is C. Immediately advise the insured that the policy clearly excludes slow leak water damage and the claim will be denied. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the PCLC to navigate the complex interplay between policy language, client expectations, and regulatory compliance when a coverage limitation is encountered. The PCLC must not only identify the limitation, but also accurately interpret its scope and communicate its implications to the client in a manner that is both legally sound and ethically responsible, avoiding any misrepresentation or undue influence. The pressure to secure a favorable outcome for the client can sometimes conflict with the strict adherence to policy terms and regulatory mandates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the insurance policy, specifically focusing on the identified exclusion or limitation clause. This includes understanding the precise wording, any definitions provided within the policy that clarify the limitation, and relevant case law or regulatory interpretations that may have shaped its application. The PCLC must then objectively assess whether the loss event falls within the scope of this limitation based on the policy's terms and conditions. The communication to the client should be clear, factual, and devoid of any attempt to persuade them to a particular interpretation that deviates from the policy's intent. This approach upholds the PCLC duty of professional competence and ethical conduct by ensuring decisions are grounded in the contract and applicable regulations, thereby protecting both the client and the integrity of the insurance process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately advising the client that the loss is covered despite the presence of a clear limitation clause. This is professionally unacceptable as it constitutes misrepresentation and a failure to adhere to the contractual terms of the insurance policy. It violates the PCLC duty to provide accurate and objective advice based on the policy's provisions and applicable regulations. Such an action could lead to a breach of contract, claim against the insurer, and potential disciplinary action against the PCLC for unethical conduct. Another incorrect approach is to unilaterally decide the loss is not covered based solely on the existence of a limitation clause, without a detailed analysis of its applicability to the specific facts of the loss. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and professional competence. The PCLC has a responsibility to thoroughly investigate and interpret the limitation in the context of the entire policy and the circumstances of the loss, rather than making a premature judgment. This could result in an unjustified denial of a valid claim, leading to client dissatisfaction and potential regulatory scrutiny. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the client's desired outcome without adequately considering the policy's limitations and regulatory requirements. While advocating for the client is important, it must be done within the bounds of the insurance contract and legal framework. Ignoring or attempting to circumvent clear policy limitations to achieve a desired result is unethical and can expose the PCLC to liability. It undermines the principles of fair dealing and accurate representation that are fundamental to the PCLC profession. Professional reasoning. The professional decision-making process for a PCLC when encountering coverage limitation should follow a structured approach. 1. Identify and isolate. Recognize the presence of a potential coverage limitation or exclusion within the policy documents. 2. Policy interpretation. Conduct a meticulous review of the specific language of the limitation clause, cross-referencing with definitions and other relevant sections of the policy. 3. Factual correlation. Objectively assess how the facts of the loss event align with the wording and intent of the limitation clause. 4. Regulatory and legal context. Consider any applicable state or federal regulations, statutes, or relevant case law that may influence the interpretation or enforceability of the limitation. 5. Objective assessment. Formulate an independent and unbiased conclusion regarding the applicability of the limitation to the claim. 6. Clear communication. Advise the client of the findings, clearly explaining the nature of the limitation, its potential impact on the claim, and the basis for the assessment, without offering guarantees or misleading assurances. 7. Documentation. Maintain thorough records of the analysis, communications, and decision-making process. Question 15. Strategic planning requires a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment for a client operating a multi-bay auto repair shop that has recently expanded its services to include custom performance tuning and the sale of specialized aftermarket parts. Considering the specific provisions and potential limitations of the garage coverage form, which of the following approaches best ensures the client's insurance program adequately addresses their evolving business exposures? Option A. Reviewing the client's current garage coverage form to identify any explicit exclusions that might apply to performance tuning or aftermarket parts sales, and then advising on endorsements to fill identified gaps or clarify coverage for these new operations. Option B. Recommending a broad increase in liability limits across the board, without a specific analysis of how the new services and parts sales interact with the garage coverage form's insuring agreements and exclusions. Option C. Assuming the existing garage coverage form provides sufficient coverage for all aspects of the auto repair business, including the new services, and only recommending adjustments if the client experiences a claim related to these new operations. Option D. Focusing the risk assessment solely on the physical damage exposures to the shop's premises and inventory, as the garage coverage form is primarily designed for property protection. The correct answer is A. Reviewing the client's current garage coverage form to identify any explicit exclusions that might apply to performance tuning or aftermarket parts sales, and then advising on endorsements to fill identified gaps or clarify coverage for these new operations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a PCLC to go beyond simply identifying potential hazards and instead to proactively assess the adequacy of existing insurance coverage in relation to evolving business operations. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of the garage coverage form and applying it to a specific, dynamic business context, ensuring that the client's financial protection aligns with their actual risks. Careful judgment is required to balance the client's desire for comprehensive coverage with the practicalities and costs of insurance, all while adhering to professional standards and regulatory expectations. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the client's current business operations, including any new services, equipment, or customer interactions, and then cross-referencing these with the specific insuring agreements and exclusions within the garage coverage form. This ensures that the coverage accurately reflects the risks undertaken. Regulatory justification for this approach stems from the PCLC duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes providing advice that leads to appropriate and sufficient insurance protection. This aligns with the general principles of professional conduct expected of licensed consultants, emphasizing competence and diligence in risk assessment and coverage analysis. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the existing garage coverage form is automatically adequate simply because it has not been recently adjusted. This failure to proactively assess evolving risks is a dereliction of professional duty. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the most common or obvious exposures covered by garage policies, neglecting less frequent but potentially significant risks that might arise from specialized services or unique operational aspects. This demonstrates a lack of comprehensive risk identification and analysis, which is a fundamental requirement for effective PCLC practice. A further incorrect approach is to recommend coverage changes based on general industry trends without a specific analysis of the client's individual operations and their interaction with the garage coverage form's provisions. This can lead to either overinsuring or underinsuring the client, both of which are professionally unacceptable outcomes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's business in detail. This involves active listening and information gathering. Subsequently, the PCLC must possess a deep understanding of the relevant insurance policy forms, including their scope, limitations, and exclusions. The process then involves mapping the identified business risks to the policy provisions, identifying any gaps or redundancies. Finally, recommendations should be clearly communicated to the client, explaining the rationale and the potential impact of proposed coverage adjustments, always prioritizing the client's informed decision-making. Question 16. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a more aggressive settlement strategy for bodily injury and property damage liability claims could reduce immediate claims expenses. But what is the most prudent approach for a certified property and casualty loss consultant to recommend when faced with potentially significant, but not yet fully quantified third-party damages? Option A. Suggest delaying any settlement discussions until the claimant initiates legal action, thereby shifting the burden of proof and cost to the claimant. Option B. Advise the insured to offer a settlement based on the lowest possible estimate of damages to minimize immediate financial outlay. Option C. Recommend a settlement based on a preliminary assessment of damages, assuming the claimant will not pursue further action if the offer is perceived as reasonable. Option D. Recommend a comprehensive investigation to fully ascertain the extent of liability and damages before proposing any settlement figure, even if it delays immediate cost savings. The correct answer is D. Recommend a comprehensive investigation to fully ascertain the extent of liability and damages before proposing any settlement figure, even if it delays immediate cost savings. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a PCLC to balance the immediate financial implications of a claim with the long-term reputational and legal risks associated with inadequate liability assessment. The PCLC must exercise sound judgment to ensure that the recommended approach to bodily injury and property damage liability is both compliant with regulatory requirements and ethically responsible, avoiding any actions that could expose the insured or insurer to undue risk or legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of all available evidence to determine the extent of the insured's liability for both bodily injury and property damage. This includes a comprehensive review of incident reports, witness statements, expert opinions, and applicable laws and regulations. The PCLC must then recommend a course of action that accurately reflects the likely legal outcomes, considering potential damages, legal defenses, and settlement possibilities. This approach is justified by the PCLC duty to act with due diligence and in the best interests of their client, the insured or insurer, adhering to the principles of professional conduct and the specific regulatory framework governing PCLC practice. This ensures fair claims handling and upholds the integrity of the insurance process. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on minimizing immediate payout without a comprehensive liability assessment fails to uphold the PCLC professional obligations. This could lead to underestimation of damages, resulting in future litigation, increased legal costs, and potential reputational damage for the insured and insurer. It also violates the ethical imperative to conduct a fair and impartial investigation. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes expediency over thoroughness, such as relying on preliminary information without verifying its accuracy or completeness, risks overlooking critical evidence that could significantly alter the liability determination. This haste can result in inaccurate assessments, leading to unfair settlements or protracted disputes, and contravenes the regulatory requirement for diligent investigation. A third incorrect approach that involves making assumptions about liability without a factual basis or legal justification is professionally unacceptable. This speculative approach can lead to incorrect conclusions about fault and damages, potentially prejudicing the outcome of the claim and exposing the insured to financial and legal jeopardy. It demonstrates a lack of professional rigor and a failure to adhere to established claims handling protocols. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the claim, starting with a clear understanding of the incident and the potential liabilities. This should be followed by a diligent investigation, gathering all relevant evidence, and consulting with legal counsel when necessary. The PCLC must then apply their expertise and knowledge of applicable laws and regulations to form an objective assessment of liability and damages. Finally, recommendations should be communicated clearly and transparently, supported by the evidence and analysis, ensuring that all parties are informed of the rationale behind the proposed course of action. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows that a commercial property experienced significant damage attributed to high winds during a recent storm. The client, the property owner, has provided an initial estimate for repairs. As a certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, what is the most appropriate initial step to take in evaluating the potential windstorm coverage options for this claim, considering the client's desire for a comprehensive recovery? Option A. Rely on general industry knowledge of typical windstorm claim payouts for similar properties to guide the initial assessment. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the insurance policy, specifically examining windstorm coverage provisions, deductibles, and any applicable endorsements or exclusions before engaging with the insurer. Option C. Immediately present the client's repair estimate to the insurance carrier to initiate the claim negotiation process. Option D. Advise the client to obtain multiple repair estimates from different contractors to establish the highest possible repair cost for the claim. The correct answer is C. Immediately present the client's repair estimate to the insurance carrier to initiate the claim negotiation process. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a scenario where a PCLC must navigate the complexities of windstorm coverage options for a commercial property. This is professionally challenging because the nuances of policy language, endorsements, and deductibles can significantly impact the client's financial recovery after a loss. The PCLC must not only understand the technical aspects of insurance, but also apply them ethically and in strict adherence to the regulatory framework governing PCLC in the specified jurisdiction. The client's expectation of a full recovery, coupled with the insurer's obligation to pay only what is contractually owed, creates a delicate balance that requires meticulous analysis and clear communication. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the specific policy language, including any endorsements or exclusions related to windstorm damage. This includes understanding the definition of windstorm as per the policy, the applicable deductible, which may be a percentage of the insured value or a fixed amount, and potentially different for named storms versus general wind events, and any limitations on coverage for specific types of damage, e.g., damage to roofs, fences, or landscaping. The PCLC must then apply this understanding to the reported loss, comparing the damages sustained against the policy's terms and conditions. This approach is correct because it aligns with the PCLC fiduciary duty to the client and the regulatory requirement to act with competence and diligence. It ensures that the claim is presented accurately and in accordance with the insurance contract, maximizing the client's potential recovery within the bounds of the policy and applicable laws. An incorrect approach would be to assume that all windstorm damage is covered equally, and to advocate for a claim amount solely based on the estimated repair costs without a detailed policy review. This fails to acknowledge the contractual limitations and potential exclusions within the policy, which could lead to an inflated claim that is ultimately denied or only partially paid. This approach violates the PCLC duty to provide accurate advice and could mislead the client about their coverage. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the insurer's initial offer without independently verifying the coverage and the extent of the damage against the policy. This approach abdicates the PCLC responsibility to advocate for the client and may result in the client accepting an offer that is less than what they are contractually entitled to. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and competence, potentially violating regulatory standards for claim handling and client representation. A third incorrect approach would be to recommend a settlement based on industry averages for similar losses, without consulting the specific policy. While industry data can provide context, it does not substitute for a precise understanding of the client's individual insurance contract. This approach risks overlooking unique policy provision that could either increase or decrease the recoverable amount, leading to an inaccurate and potentially detrimental recommendation for the client. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive review of the insurance policy, including all endorsements and exclusions. This should be followed by a detailed assessment of the loss, documenting all damages and their relationship to the covered peril. The PCLC must then reconcile the policy terms with the documented damages to determine the scope of coverage and the applicable deductible. Throughout this process, clear and transparent communication with the client regarding coverage limitations and potential outcomes is paramount. Question 18. Process analysis reveals that a PCLC is assessing a property damage claim following a fire. The insured's policy defines building as the dwelling and attached structures. The insured is claiming coverage for a custom-built, attached greenhouse that was significantly damaged. The greenhouse is constructed with a permanent foundation, is wired for electricity, and is plumbed for water, but it was added to the dwelling after the original construction and is not explicitly listed as a separate structure in the policy declarations. Based on the regulatory framework and policy language for the Certified Property and Casualty Loss Consultant (PCLC) exam, which approach best determines if the greenhouse is considered covered property. Option A. Assume the greenhouse is covered property because it is physically attached to the dwelling and has utilities, as this is a common practice for attached structures. Option B. Determine coverage by examining the policy's definition of building and attached structures, cross-referencing with applicable state insurance regulations and case law regarding permanent additions and their insurability. Option C. Classify the greenhouse as personal property or an unlisted addition, and therefore not covered unless explicitly named in the policy declarations. Option D. Rely on the insured's assertion that the greenhouse is an integral part of their home and therefore should be covered under the dwelling definition. The correct answer is B. Determine coverage by examining the policy's definition of building and attached structures, cross-referencing with applicable state insurance regulations and case law regarding permanent additions and their insurability. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the PCLC to navigate the nuanced definition of covered property under the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the Certified Property and Casualty Loss Consultant (PCLC) exam's jurisdiction, which is assumed to be a U.S. state-based regulatory environment for the purpose of this exam. The challenge lies in distinguishing between property that is inherently part of the insured structure and property that might be considered personal property or an addition, even if attached. PCLC must apply the policy language and governing regulations precisely to avoid underpayment or overpayment of claims, which can lead to regulatory scrutiny and damage to the consultant's reputation. Careful judgment is required to interpret policy definitions and applicable statutes without making assumptions. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the insurance policy's definitions of building, structure, and covered property, cross-referencing these with the specific state's insurance regulations and relevant case law concerning what constitutes part of the insured premises. This approach prioritizes adherence to the contractual agreement between the insurer and the insured, as well as compliance with regulatory mandates that define insurable interests and coverage. By focusing on the policy's explicit language and the governing legal framework, the PCLC ensures that the claim is handled in a manner that is both legally sound and ethically responsible, protecting both the insured's rights and the insurer's obligations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any item physically attached to the building is automatically covered property. This fails to account for policy exclusions, specific definitions that might differentiate between structural components and additions that may have separate coverage limits or be considered personal property. Such an assumption could lead to a denial of coverage for items that are, in fact, covered, or conversely, an overpayment for items that are not. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the insured's subjective belief about what should be covered, without independent verification against the policy and regulations. This bypasses the PCLC professional duty to objectively assess the claim based on established criteria. A third incorrect approach would be to apply a generic industry standard for similar losses without consulting the specific policy and applicable state regulations, as coverage can vary significantly by policy and jurisdiction. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the policy contract, identification of all relevant definitions and exclusions pertaining to covered property, and research into the specific states' insurance laws and regulations that govern property coverage. The PCLC should then apply these findings to the specific facts of the loss, documenting each step of the analysis. This methodical approach ensures that decisions are grounded in evidence and legal requirements, promoting fairness and accuracy in claim handling. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that policyholders often have differing interpretations of what constitutes debris removal versus general cleanup or restoration following a covered property loss. A certified property and casualty loss consultant, PCLC, is presented with a claim where a severe windstorm caused significant structural damage to a commercial building, resulting in fallen debris both inside and outside the structure. The policy includes a specific sublimit for debris removal. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical obligations for handling this aspect of the claim? Option A. The PCLC should apply the full debris removal sublimit without detailed assessment, assuming that the extent of the storm damage automatically justifies the maximum coverage available. Option B. The PCLC should estimate debris removal costs based on a standard industry percentage applied to the total property damage, as this is a common practice for expediting claims. Option C. The PCLC should consider all costs associated with clearing the property of any damaged items and materials, regardless of whether they are explicitly defined as debris in the policy, to ensure the policyholder feels their property is fully restored. Option D. The PCLC should meticulously review the policy's debris removal clause, including any sublimits and exclusions, and assess the actual costs incurred by the policyholder for the necessary removal of damaged property that constitutes debris as defined by the policy, ensuring compliance with any applicable environmental regulations for disposal. Correct answer is D. The PCLC should meticulously review the policy's debris removal clause, including any sublimits and exclusions, and assess the actual costs incurred by the policyholder for the necessary removal of damaged property that constitutes debris as defined by the policy, ensuring compliance with any applicable environmental regulations for disposal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because debris removal costs can be a significant and often contentious aspect of property and casualty claims. The PCLC must navigate the policy language, applicable regulations, and the physical realities of the loss to ensure fair and accurate settlement. The challenge lies in distinguishing between covered debris removal and other types of cleanup or restoration, and in applying the correct valuation methods within the bounds of the policy and regulatory requirements. Careful judgment is required to avoid underpayment, which could lead to claimant dissatisfaction and regulatory scrutiny, or overpayment, which could result in financial loss for the insurer. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's debris removal clause, including any sublimits or specific exclusions. It requires understanding the definition of debris as it pertains to the covered peril and the scope of necessary removal to restore the property to a safe and usable condition, or to prevent further damage. This approach aligns with the PCLC duty to act in good faith and fair dealing, ensuring that the policyholder receives the benefits to which they are entitled under the contract, while also adhering to the insurer's obligations. Regulatory frameworks typically mandate that insurers settle claims promptly and fairly, and this approach directly supports that mandate by accurately assessing and compensating for covered debris removal expenses. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cost of disposing of damaged materials, without considering whether those materials constitute debris, as defined by the policy, or the necessity of their removal to mitigate further damage, would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to adhere to the policy contract and could lead to the insurer paying for non-covered services. Another incorrect approach that involves applying a standard percentage for debris removal without a specific policy provision or a detailed assessment of the actual costs incurred would also be a failure. This method is arbitrary and does not reflect the actual loss experienced by the policyholder, potentially leading to underpayment and violating the principle of indemnification. Furthermore, an approach that ignores policy limitations or exclusions related to debris removal, such as those for gradual deterioration or faulty workmanship, would be a direct violation of the policy terms and regulatory requirements governing claims handling. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a comprehensive review of the policy contract, paying close attention to the specific language of the debris removal coverage. This should be followed by a detailed inspection of the loss site to document the nature and extent of the debris. The PCLC must then research and apply relevant local or state regulations pertaining to debris removal and disposal, ensuring compliance with environmental and safety standards. Finally, the PCLC should communicate clearly with the policyholder regarding the coverage and the basis for the debris removal settlement. Fostering transparency and trust. Question 20. The monitoring system demonstrates a potential policy exclusion that may impact the current property insurance claim. Which of the following actions best reflects a PCLC professional responsibility in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the claim assessment as if the exclusion does not apply, assuming the insurer will overlook it. Option B. Delay informing the policyholder about the exclusion until the insurer has made a final coverage determination. Option C. Immediately advise the policyholder that the exclusion definitively denies coverage and cease further involvement. Option D. Inform the policyholder of the potential exclusion's impact and immediately initiate a formal review with the insurer to explore all coverage options, including potential waivers or interpretations. The correct answer is C. Immediately advise the policyholder that the exclusion definitively denies coverage and cease further involvement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a PCLC to balance the immediate need for policyholder communication with the imperative to provide accurate and legally compliant information. Misinformation or delayed communication can lead to significant financial and reputational damage for both the policyholder and the insurer, and can also result in regulatory scrutiny. The PCLC must exercise careful judgment to ensure all actions align with established property insurance principles and relevant regulations. The correct approach involves proactively informing the policyholder about the potential impact of the identified policy exclusion on their claim, while simultaneously initiating a formal review process with the insurer to explore all available avenues for coverage. This approach upholds the principle of utmost good faith by ensuring transparency and diligent investigation. It aligns with regulatory expectations that claims handling be fair, prompt, and based on a thorough understanding of the policy terms and conditions. By seeking clarification and potential exceptions from the insurer, the PCLC acts as a trusted advisor, advocating for the policyholder within the bounds of the policy and applicable laws. An incorrect approach would be to simply inform the policyholder that the exclusion definitively bars coverage without first consulting the insurer for clarification or potential waivers. This fails to uphold the duty of diligent investigation and can be seen as prematurely denying a claim, potentially violating fair claims practices. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the exclusion and proceed as if coverage is certain, which would be a dereliction of professional duty and could lead to the insurer denying the claim later, leaving the policyholder exposed and the PCLC liable. Finally, delaying communication with the policyholder until the insurer makes a final decision, even if that decision is favorable, is also an incorrect approach. It violates the principle of prompt communication and can erode policyholder trust, potentially leading to complaints and regulatory action. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes clear, accurate, and timely communication, coupled with a thorough and diligent investigation of all claim circumstances. This involves understanding the policy language, identifying potential coverage issues, consulting with the insurer for clarification or exceptions, and keeping the policyholder informed throughout the process. Adherence to regulatory guidelines and ethical principles of fairness and good faith should guide every step.